The Egg with 1,000 Mothers by Aaron Vlek. Yasuge grunted in his sleep and opened his eyes. He had to piss. Spewing an angry curse into the frosty night air, he squeezed his eyes shut and tried to ignore it. It was bitterly cold. It was late, or early, depending on which day you were talking about, and he could hear the winds ripping through the tight cluster of yurts like a horde of demons in rut. He cursed again at the thought of crawling outside onto the frozen earth and baring his flesh to the biting wind, and vowed, for the 100th time, never again to drink so much kumis, at least not late at night. But it had been such a great celebration. Long trailing streams of Karate sheep herders and traders, pony breeders, raiders, minor outcasts and nameless wanderers from the furthest reaches of the steppe had been trickling into the Khan's summer camp for days to share in the storytelling and feasting, and to dip their cups into the endless rivers of kumis that flowed day and night from the Khan's wooden casks. Yasuge was especially pleased with the 6 excellent ponies the Khan had awarded him from the spoils of the raiding party. The Khan himself had laid the ropes that bound the animals into his waiting hands, hands that raised in a gesture of beseeching and expectation before a benevolent lord. The Khan had made a great show of the giving before 1,000 pairs of watching eyes. Yasuge grinned in the darkness, envisaging the spirited white mare with the mismatched blue and brown eyes he'd keep for himself, the gentle bay he'd use to lure a strong young wife to his bed, or at least some warm companionship, and the pale mare with the red mane he'd seen the Khan's youngest daughter openly admire. He'd give this pony to the girl as a gift, a show of thanks to his Khan. He rolled over in the darkness and dragged the pony's skin onto his shoulders, and then bellowed in rage. The furs he wrapped himself in on the coldest nights had slipped off and his rear end was naked. He cursed again and realized it was no use. The need to relieve himself could not be ignored. He staggered to his feet, steadying his weary body against his carved walking stick, and stretched, hearing his joints creak and sigh in protest. Yasuge stood for a moment in the darkness, rubbing his hands together and blowing hot breath into his cupped fingers. That's when he heard the sound. It was the old woman. He shuddered violently, but this time not from the cold. He reconsidered whether he should go outside at all, or just relieve himself inside the yurt and cover it over with dirt, or bury himself in his pony's skins and try to go back to sleep, or just tell himself the sound was only a dream, nothing more than the clinging remains of a harmless nightmare. 1. 2 half rotations of the great Mother Moon. Soraya squatted in the mud and stood her ground. Licking her fingers clean, she grunted with satisfaction and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. It was good, this big juicy piece of fat she'd ripped away from the dogs. She had beaten the big yellow one almost senseless with her walking stick to get the meat out of his huge jaws. He still growled as he watched her stuff the dripping flesh into her mouth. The brute had kept his distance though, and the rest of the pack wisely followed his lead. She tossed her long black matted braid over her shoulder and edged away from the pack, never turning her back on them as she made her way to where the ponies lay hobbled in the tall grasses. Dropping to the ground, she pressed herself against the body of the young chestnut mare, nestling in the pony's mane as in a thick blanket, and pulling her neck close like that of a lover. Soraya closed her eyes and savoured the soft nickering and snuffling, the flutter of large wings all around her, and the warmth of the animal's breath that kept the cold night air at bay. After a few minutes, her eyes shot open and she gasped, peeling away the damp layers of her robes and wincing with agony and fear as she examined the horrible festering gash that ate away the flesh of her belly. The burned skin was black and peeling, and a crawling sickness gripped her insides as she examined the strange wound. The agonizing pain vanished as it had appeared, and she relaxed and closed her eyes. She wasn't sleepy, but she had nothing to do and of course no one to talk to. The others shunned her now. They no longer ordered her to serve them, no more calls for tea or wine. They wouldn't even let her milk the roan sheep or draw water from the stream. Even her friend Yasuge would have nothing to do with her now. He stayed far away, after banishing her from his tent and tossing her few belongings into the snow. So now, she made her bed among the ponies. Soraya knew it was fear that stopped them from slitting her throat in the middle of the night and leaving her corpse behind for the vultures, or abandoning her alive to the wolves of the steppe. They didn't know what to do with her now, or how far they dared to go to be rid of her. So they did nothing. Nothing to harm her, nothing to keep her alive. Yasuge's people had taken her in a raiding party 4 summers ago. He had spotted her in the cook's tent. Indeed, she had been that cook's wife, so Yasuge asked to keep her as his own. His companions had laughed long and hard, saying Yasuge was too old to make proper use of a woman. He had insisted. She could be useful to him, he'd said, in his own duties to the Khan. They had relented, and she was grateful for that. So grateful. Her husband had died in that raid, and she hadn't even cared. She'd loathed the sight of the man and was glad for a change of scenery. When Soraya first laid eyes on Yasuge, she thought he must be some great warrior. The noble head was tattooed and clean-shaven, except for a long jet-black braid that spilled over his shoulder and fell to his waist. The quilted leathers that covered his short, squat body were stiff with years of campfire smoke and dried blood, and the urine of horses rubbed into the flesh to drive away the flies and other vermin. His face was almost black with the sigils of his gods and the dirt of the road. A fine necklace of talismans, feathers, twigs, and bones dangled from his waist, while a shard from the skull of some fallen enemy hung from a chain of human hair around his neck. To Soraya, Yasuge had been magnificent. As she came to know him, she saw he was no warrior, no killer of men. The only slaughtering Yasuge did was goats, fatted sheep, and the sweet winter onions that grew wild along the river's edge. She was happy under Yasuge's protection. He'd kept her belly full and let her sleep inside out of the cold. These things had remained the same for 3 summers. Then one day, as the winds changed and the tall grasses of the steppe turned the color of sand and fire with the rising of the autumn moon, they had come upon a small Shukit hunting party. The hunters pitched their tents on the bank of a shallow stream that was no more than a muddy smear this time of year. It was a smaller horde than any Shukit hunting or raiding party she'd ever seen. It had been a strange camp, and Yasuge had said they were outlaws, driven off from their own to survive as they could or die of starvation. Soraya hacked up a bitter chuckle at the remembering. A strange camp indeed. The Shukit had fought with their usual savagery until the last of them lay butchered in a pool of blood on the plain. A disturbing oddity had curdled the winds of triumph. The Shukit had not made a sound as they fought. No curses, no yelling, no taunting roar of insult, no groans and screams of agony and rage, just fighting and killing and dying. She'd been riding an old wingless pack pony that day, back when they still allowed her to ride. She and Yasuge stood side by side at the crest of a small rise, watching the battle as their companions fell upon the camp. Her breath caught in her throat and her eyes narrowed as she leaned forward onto the pony's neck to get a closer look at the nearly silent bloodbath, where only the voices of their own men rose above the carnage. She had exchanged troubled glances with Yasuge when she saw he'd noticed it too. Something not quite right about the Shukit. That was all forgotten when the fighting was done, and their men stripped the tents and the bodies of the dead of their valuables and weapons, of anything that might be traded or sold for a few coins in the market. Later, Soraya and Yasuge rode into the smoking ruins to claim their share of the pillage. There wasn't much left that anyone would want, but she liked to explore. Even if she didn't find anything of value, she always learned something about a people from the remains of their camp. Something interesting that separated the tribes from one another. This amused her, so she never left anything unturned, no matter how ordinary or worthless it might seem. She roused herself from her memories and gritted her teeth, marveling at just how cursed her life had been since that day. Stupid, greedy woman, she grunted through her tears as her mind cleared for a moment, and then slid away into the cloying fog of nightmares. She pulled 2 strands of beads from the tangled thicket of talismans she wore beneath her robes, one of tiny purple stones and another of amber. Savoring the cool, hard surfaces, she tumbled them through her fingers. The finely worked silver image of a naked man, his hands and feet bound to a cross, dangled from the end of the purple beads. A twisted mask of pain and ecstasy illuminated his youthful features. A dying shaman had pressed the curious beads into her hands with such a terrible urgency it had scared her, and she tried to pull away. The old man's grasp had been like that of a vulture, and she'd been unable to break free from the mad gaze of his bloodshot eyes. The beads possess magical powers. His foul breath had gasped into her ear. The man on the cross would do her bidding if she recited his incantations, if she memorized them and told them by heart, aloud or in secret. The shaman's instructions broke off as he coughed up his last breath with a mouthful of foul blood. She'd remembered his promise, though, even if she hadn't learned the words of magic that would make the man on the cross do her bidding. She raised the other length of beads and brought it close to her eye. This one was more to her liking. Smooth, round amber beads, with one long, slender bead the length of her little finger dangling from the end, and no dead man. An acolyte of the savage winged god Borokut, a wretch in a patched robe and long matted hair, had given her this one. He had travelled with them for 5 days, having offered the Khan's men a few coins and some songs for his safe passage to the edge of the desert. The man, little more than a creature, had been completely naked beneath his tattered robes, and had insisted on exposing his diseased body to her. He'd been smeared head to toe with ashes and sheep fat, worked into sigils and crude patterns, and his face had been a mask of unspeakable brutality. His feet were bare, dark like a pony's hooves, with toenails as long and thick as claws. He had disappeared in the middle of the night, leaving nothing behind but this strand of amber he'd left dangling from her tent pole. She found beauty in these strange trinkets, and wore them all pressed against her full breasts along with other talismans, the signs and sigils of gods and demons, magicians, sorceresses, wise men, charlatans and shamans from a dozen friendly and enemy peoples, and strangers of the steppe. For herself, she wore the jawbone of the wolf, and the feathers of the osprey and the black kite bound together with 3 of her teeth, drilled and polished and threaded on a strand of sheep's gut. These were the symbols of her gods and demon allies. She had relied upon them more surely than she could upon any naked man who couldn't even save himself from the cross. She absently pulled a small wooden pot of scented fat from the deepest pocket of her robe and worked the fragrant goo into the flesh of her face to protect it from the wind, and to remind herself that she was, after all, still a woman, even if now old and, somehow, different than before. Soraya muttered a small curse toward the northern horizon, and it carried her to yet another breeze of dark memory. In the ruins of the Shukit camp, many horrors had awaited them. In the cook fires of the tents, they'd found the old, charred bones of Shukit riders, women and children, many with arms and legs obviously partially savaged and devoured, their faces frozen in horror and disbelief. Inside the tents were more bloody bodies, rotted and showing signs of the same ravenous feasting. The Khan's men swore and muttered angry curses while making the intricate sign of protection in the air with their fingers. The Shukit kept no dogs, or any other such creatures known to savour the taste of sentient flesh. Their tribe always set the bodies of the dead alight amidst prayer and other rituals of honor and dignity, as did all tribes of true men. Soraya found something else among the rubble to add to her growing collection of interesting things. It was buried in a small fire pit. The body of a dead Shukit lay nearby, the flesh of his hands burned away down to the charred blackened bones as they still gripped the rim of the pit. In the throes of battle, the vanquished often tossed their valuables into the flames so the victorious could not claim their wealth along with their lives. So Soraya always sifted carefully through such remains. Among the ashes, she had dug out several fat red embers with an old wooden ladle and tossed them into a pot with its handle wrapped in sheepskin. She would use these later in her own fire. She was about to turn away when another ember glowing in the rubble caught her eye. Shoving the ladle deeper into the ash, she lobbed the ember into her pot and watched, wide-eyed, as it pulsed with a dull red glow unlike any fire. Poking it with her finger, she found it was icy cold to the touch and hard as stone. Quelling her excitement, she had hidden the curious object inside her heavy robes. "It's a jewel, maybe even a ruby of great value," she'd giggled, imagining the mountain of coins such a treasure would bring at the trader's fair. The wind blew up, and she roused herself. Hugging the pony's neck, she surrendered once again to deeper memories. As soon as they'd returned to their own camp that day, Soraya had run to her tent so she could examine her discovery far from greedy, prying eyes. Opening her robes, she had screamed in pain and dropped the stone to the ground. The thing glowed red-hot again and had burned through the thick padding of her coat and inner garments, leaving a deep, bloody gash across her belly. This was no jewel, but it was no ember either. It was icy cold once more, and it twinkled like a hideous, unblinking eye. The smooth, brittle shape was like that of an egg the size of her fist. She plucked it up with her fingers, wrapped in the hem of her tunic, and brought it closer to her face. Then it tumbled from her grasp, and she shrieked, clutching her hand to her mouth in fear. The thing had made a sound. She staggered to her feet and stumbled outside, where she grabbed her belly as her stomach heaved and dumped its contents on the ground. Soraya gasped for breath and wiped her mouth with her sleeve and turned to run. Before she could take a single step, she froze and stood blinking and looking around as the others looked at her as though she'd gone mad. She had heard the sound again, but this time it was inside her head, and she could make out what it was. A voice whispering her name. Since that night, she had guarded her secret jealously as the others turned against her and life among the Khan's men shattered into bloody and blasphemous disarray. Soraya finished her reveries and staggered to her feet. With tears streaming down her face, she kissed the perfectly smooth, fiery stone, regretting her foolish desire to be free of such a sacred burden. Its heat burned away the flesh from her lips, so she wrapped it again in the folds of her robes and pressed it against her breast, where it drank its fill, not of milk nor blood, but something far deeper, past flesh and bone and sinew. It was a jinn's egg, a mighty jinn who had come to her from a place between the stars. A jinn that would soon sit upon his throne and watch as the world burned to ashes. Soraya knew she must nurture this egg, as she would her own child. She saw all in her mind's eye as she cradled her burden against her breast and sung to it the lullaby of fire and stars that had infused into the deepest folds of her mind. The Shukit had fed the egg as her own tribe must feed it now. 100 tribes before the Shukit had done so, and 100 more across a vast span of years. 1,000 mothers such as Soraya had been needed to birth the world egg. Soon it would open and reveal its dark red fruit, and the most powerful jinn in 1,000 years would come forth to claim his throne. Now she must wash the egg clean and ready it for birth. She drew her dagger from the sheath at her knee. Creeping among the yurts, she set many fires and buried her dagger deep in the bellies of as many men as she could, as they stumbled from their tents half naked and confused into the darkness. They cut her down with 12 arrows, but it had begun. The night would be a very long one. On the morrow, a Bushkai raiding party from the south would come upon the carnage where none still lived. They would rejoice at their good fortune and pillage the ruins of the Khan's encampment for all that remained of value. Among the half-burned tents, they would find a child, a strange and miraculous child whose touch burned away the flesh and froze the mind as it drank deep beyond blood, beyond bone, beyond sinew.